It begins with a sound you can't quite place. Distant engines, hurried footsteps, the snap of gunfire folding into the wind. Then, the silence that follows isn't silence at all. It's the kind that hums with fear. In the North Darfur city of El Fasher, that hum broke into a roar as the rapid support forces pushed through streets already starved of food, light, and hope. Witnesses call it a killing field. Satellite images call it something worse: evidence. By the end of October, the last major Sudanese Army foothold in Darfur fell. What followed has been described in clinical terms: mass killings, summary executions, targeted attacks on hospitals, because language buckles under the weight of what people actually saw. A maternity hospital full of patients and families. Hours later, a morgue without names. Hundreds, said doctors and aid agencies. Appalling, said the United Nations. Ongoing, said the satellites. And none of those words bring anyone back. To understand how El Fasher became a massacre, we have to talk about the RSF. Born from the Janjaweed militias that terrorized Darfur 2 decades ago and formalized into a paramilitary force that the world never quite managed to contain. In 2014 and 2015, Human Rights Watch documented RSF village burning, looting, rape, and executions. Patterns that look bleakly familiar today. The vocabulary hasn't changed. The victims have. In April 2023, the fragile relationship between Sudan's regular army, the SAF, and the RSF snapped over who would control the future of the state and how fast the RSF would be folded into it. What followed is the worst displacement crisis on Earth, with more than 14 million people driven from their homes. For many months, El Fasher was the last SAF-held city in Darfur, a humanitarian hub sheltering roughly 260,000 civilians, and ringed by camps that swelled as fighting intensified. The city's fall would not only be a military outcome, but also a human catastrophe. We now know it was both. The last week of October is the pivot. Over October 26th to 28th, RSF columns pushed into El Fasher, breaching the SAF's final strongpoints. The Washington Post's correspondents, working through blackout conditions, confirmed RSF entry and seizure of key sites, while Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab fused open-source reporting with fresh satellite passes to corroborate the city's fall. Those same images, grim as an autopsy, showed clusters consistent with human bodies, new Earth discolorations, and vehicle patterns that match door-to-door operations. This isn't rhetoric, it's pixels. And then came the hospital. The Saudi Maternity Hospital, already a lifeline in a city starved of care, became a killing ground. The World Health Organization and Sudanese medics put the reported number at roughly 460 dead. Patients, caregivers, the people who loved them, after gunmen swept through in waves. Eyewitnesses said RSF fighters were also going house to house, shooting those who fled and those who didn't. Even in a war numbed by numbers, that number is hard to hold in your head. We are not relying only on testimony. In back-to-back situation reports, the Yale team documented imagery consistent with mass killings in multiple locations in and around El Fasher after the RSF entered the city. One set of images shows linear clusters the size of human bodies. Another shows the rise of fresh, red ground stains not present before the assault. Additional analysis from October 28th, day 2 of RSF control, corroborated continuing executions across neighborhoods. As investigators like to say, the map talks if you learn to listen. Here, it won't stop talking. If you're asking how an entire city can be turned into a trap, the answer is grimly simple. Build the trap first. In August, Yale's lab flagged more than 31 kilometers of earth berms, literal walls of dirt, constructed around El Fasher, segment by segment, choking exit routes and tightening the noose. Journalists and analysts called it a kill box. Residents didn't need the metaphor. Try to run and you meet a barrier. Try to skirt it and you meet a gun. Inside the city, survivors talk of door-to-door sweeps, men forced to kneel in the streets, women and children shot as they fled. One man who made it to Tawila described bodies everywhere, the kind of sentence that lives only in nightmares and wire copy. The RSF's leader, General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, Hemeti, has acknowledged violations while denying a policy of mass murder. The UN human rights chief called the reports appalling, and he's not a man given to adjectives. Outside the city, the hemorrhage continues. Aid groups say roughly 600,000 people fled toward Tawila and other towns, overwhelming clinics that are clinics in name and tents in reality. The death toll is uncounted because counting requires a pause the killers won't give and a cellular signal that rarely comes. If geopolitics had a stress test, this would be the load-bearing wall, and it just cracked. Why now? In this war, the answer to why is usually supply lines. The RSF's push to take Fasher consolidates control over all 5 Darfur state capitals and links routes west toward Libya. That matters for fuel, ammunition, and profit. Inputs any warlord needs to become a state within a state. Diplomats whisper de facto partition because nobody wants to say it out loud. But maps don't care what we call them. They only show who moves where. Who arms whom is the other question that returns like a bad signal. Analysts and investigators have traced supply networks to foreign patrons and private channels. A CNN segment featured a regional expert stating the RSF is mainly supported by the UAE. Allegations that British lawmakers echoed in calls to suspend UK arms sales to Abu Dhabi until the risk of diversion is dismissed. The US, for its part, sanctioned an RSF-linked figure for procuring vehicles via a UAE-based company. Everyone denies something. The paper trail denies less. Meanwhile, the war's technological layer keeps thickening. Drones and artillery strikes, cheap, plentiful, and terrifyingly accurate in urban grids, were reported in Fasher even before the city fell, hitting neighborhoods and camps for the displaced. Open source analysts aren't replacing investigators, they're multiplying them. From the ground, survivors film the smoke. From orbit, analysts mark the stains. If there's a grim joke left here, it's that even OSINT laptops are overheating. Nobody's laughing. And then there's the hospital question, because combatants who attack hospitals attack the very idea of survival. The WHO condemned the slaughter at the Saudi Maternity Hospital in language so stark it left no room for doubt. The pattern mirrors earlier RSF behaviour in Darfur, captured years ago by researchers who warned the world what this force does when it meets a civilian neighbourhood. Warnings, alas, are not armour. Fasher's fall reshapes the battlefield and the region. With the SAF's last outpost in Darfur gone, RSF control of western corridors hardens. That puts further pressure on Chad, which is already absorbing waves of refugees and guarding a frontier that doesn't end at a line on a map. It puts pressure on Libya's south, where armed groups and smugglers blend as seamlessly as two bad ideas. It places a question mark over Sudan's territorial future, an east held by the army, a west held by the RSF, and a capital, Khartoum, that has become a cautionary tale in concrete. It also poses a test to the international system we say exists. The UN warned of summary executions, ethnic targeting, and mass atrocities. Yale's imagery says killings continued even after the initial wave. Media outlets from Al Jazeera to Time and The Guardian corroborate through videos, interviews, and cross-checking with satellite passes. What stops a kill box isn't a statement, it's leverage. What stops a war of supply is interrupting the supply. Everyone understands this. Not everyone is willing to do it. Inside Sudan, the legacy is even harsher. Once civilians learn that hospitals are targets and escape routes are walls, the social contract snaps. When a force learns the world will watch a hospital die and issue a press release, it learns a darker lesson. This is why investigators reach for the word genocidal. It is not a metaphor. It is a warning label pasted on a live wire. Back to the street-level view. Survivors describe RSF fighters moving house to house, rounding up men of fighting age, executing others in front of their families. These aren't rumours from the fog of war. They're consistent across interviews and match patterns the RSF has used for years. Even the RSF leaders' half-admission, violations acknowledged, responsibility blurred, fits the mould. We're seeing atrocities, say UN officials. The only debate left is how many, all of which puts El Fasher in a terrible place, both symptom and signal. Symptom because the city's agony is what happens when a war drags on. Supply routes widen and accountability shrinks. Signal because the speed and scale of the killings after the city fell may preview what happens next across the West if nothing interrupts it. We talk about escalation in conflict studies. Here, escalation looks like hospital corridors. And yes, there is a military dimension as cold as algebra. The RSF's gains changed the SAF's strategic calculus. Without El Fasher, army counteroffensives in Darfur become harder, not impossible, but costly in blood and logistics. With the RSF entrenched, any future talks will be held with a map on the table that favors the men in pickup trucks. Sometimes, facts on the ground are built with shovels first and bullets after. Statements arrived as they always do: stern, formal, necessary. UN leaders condemned horrifying mass killings. Foreign ministries urged restraint, pressed for humanitarian corridors, and promised sanctions. Those tools matter, but in a conflict this privatized, with procurement networks routed through commercial fronts and friendly capitals, sanctions alone are a tourniquet, vital but not surgery. When British MPs called to halt arms exports to any state that could be funneling weapons to the RSF, they're admitting the obvious. You can't plead innocence while paying the quartermaster. Across the Atlantic, US sanctions on RSF-linked facilitators send another signal. This war won't be financed in daylight. Still, enforcement is everything. The RSF doesn't need an aircraft carrier. It needs fuel for a column, spares for a technical, and ammunition that crosses a sandy border at dusk. Cut those, and momentum bleeds away. Miss them, and cities fall. It's logistics, not legend. It's tempting in military analysis to talk in arrows and axes, to narrate the tactical sweep. But the story here is the crushed center of a city and the hollowed center of families. More than 14 million displaced across Sudan, a number that sounds like a statistic until you meet one of them. In El Fasher, that abstract became a week of choices no human should face. Go out and risk a bullet, stay in and wait for the knock. When the knock came, it spoke in a language of orders and gunmetal. The videos that reached newsrooms and investigators showed the aftermath. Streets dotted with bodies, smoke twisting over low roofs, the chaos of flight. Survivors carried what they could. Many carried only the memory of who had held their hands the day before. On social feeds, some called the scene apocalyptic. On analysis decks, someone wrote, ongoing. The words are accurate. None are sufficient. If nothing changes, RSF control of Darfur will consolidate. If something changes, it will be because supply lines were pinched, military pressure altered calculations, or a diplomatic package offered both face-saving and fear. No single lever works alone, but we've seen in other wars what happens when you combine three things: real sanctions with teeth, interdiction of material support, and visible consequences for commanders who order hospital killings. That third one isn't performative. It's a message to every subordinate with a trigger finger and a memory. Inside Sudan's command tent, the SAF will look east and north for gains to trade, and west for what it lost. It will point to the horror in El Fasher and ask the world which side it is on. But the record shows atrocities on more than one set of hands since 2023, and accountability isn't a loyalty program. If you care about civilians, you care about them on both ends of the barrel. A small, hard truth. In the short term, the people most likely to change the trajectory in Darfur are the ones who load the trucks and sign the export papers. If that feels unheroic, remember that wars run on logistics. So does mercy. El Fasher is a warning siren you can see from space. The berms ring the city like a fist. The hospital's halls echo with what we didn't stop. The road to Tawila is crowded with those who can still walk. We have the imagery, the testimony, and, painfully, the precedent. The question is whether we have the will to make those things matter. When we strip the acronyms away, a truth remains. Armies fight over cities. History remembers what was done to the people inside them. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Simple enough to fit on the end of a teleprompter and heavy enough to hang in the air. Now that we've watched the graveyard from orbit, what are we going to do for the living on the ground?